It's right here. Security
The
accounts.
security accounts manager.
Yes. And I know because we use SAM with Cengage. So it's just remember that it's just a database, a security database for IDs and passwords. Okay. And when you create an account, you give that person rights to certain things. You can give them permissions to certain printers, certain files, certain directories. You can also make sure that they don't access like HR files or that kind of thing. And these permissions are controlled by access control list, ACL. So say you've got a whole group of people you want to set, you can set the permissions at the group level. So you can have group accounts. So a local group account, basically, it's just a account basically stored in the Windows database system also. But that you can assign whatever permissions or deny permissions that you want to for a list of local users. So you've got different levels that you can set this up at. Windows Server 2019, it's basically a work group and it's got 2 local user accounts, admin rights to most resources and guest rights, which is basically just a minimal set of rights for those. Now, with everything that's going on today, most companies don't have a guest account. So basically, if you don't have an ID to log into the system, they delete the guest account. So users can't come in and use a guest account on that machine. Because basically, what's that allowing them?
It's allowing like someone you don't know access to your system.
Right. They've already gotten through the router. They're already on the inside of the system if you do that. So by default, we always deleted that account. We never let anybody use any hardware on site that didn't have their own ID. Okay, they want you to know what a standalone server is. Basically, it's just a server that's part of a work group instead of on the network. Okay, by default, the local group accounts that are used to assign rights and permissions to users, administrators, guests, and users. So by default, that's set up for you. Okay, like I said, you need to think about what and how you're going to allow users to log on. Administrators, you usually create a group of people that have that access. And of course, users are everybody that's actually going to be using anything on your network, because they're going to have an account just to print. So, so basically, you can set these groups up and you can add rights to a group. Say you wanted to do a whole engineering department and everybody in the engineering department has access to a certain file, the engineering file, where they store all their drawings and procedures. So you would associate those with those rights associated to that group. Okay. Local users and groups. This is a snap-in that you can use for it. It's an MMC, a Microsoft Management Console snap-in, and there's a lot of different ones, but this one is displayed in this figure 4.1. So it shows you how to do that. You can actually open this if you'll see what's highlighted, the mmc.exe command. You can use PowerShell. You can use the command prompt, either one, to execute that. Okay, so you're going to create a user. So you make sure you're in the users folder. You see right here by default, the first 3 that we talked about. Why is this 4th one in here? What is the 4th one? Does anybody know? It's for software use. Okay, so you're going to set up a new user. All right, so here's the user that they're creating. He's part of the marketing department. Okay, the options under here, of course, user must change password at next logon. So you create a password for them and you provide them with this password. Okay, so they're logging on the system for the first time. They put their ID in there that you've created, and you need to figure out what nomenclature you're going to use and be standard with it. Of course, all the IDs have to be unique, but if you don't check this first box when you set their password up, who's responsible for anything that user does?
You.
Both of you. Because if you don't make them change their password, then you know what their password is, and that's what they assume. So if you create passwords and set up new IDs for people, make sure you make them change their password when they log on. Okay, and a user cannot change the password if you've got a generic ID, like your tech support group would have, a generic ID that the whole team uses. You don't want somebody on the team changing the password and nobody else can access it. So you don't let any of the users in that group change the password. Okay, password never expires. We don't use those. We never use the password never expires when we set up an account, because we had to, because of security, we had to even change our admin passwords. Okay. When would you use accounts disabled? The last option in this figure 4.3.
If the user leaves the company?
Yes. You don't want to delete their ID. If they leave, you want to disable it. And we'll talk about it later, but there's a unique SID. It's a security identification that's attached to every ID. And if you delete this account, even if you create this exact same account, it's going to have a different SID assigned to it. And that SID can't be used again. So basically, if Bob left the company, you could disable the account and create a script that after 90 days of disabled, it automatically deletes them. But that way, if he comes back, then you can just enable the account again and, of course, change the password. And, of course, the account names must be unique. The Server 2019 password requirements, they have to be 6 characters and cannot contain account names or portions of the user's full name. So basically, 6 characters, not a lot. I know most applications require 8 characters now, but for some reason, Windows Server 2019 only requires 6. Our administrator IDs had to be 16 characters long. And our administrator IDs, password, and our ID passwords could not be the same. So you can set a lot of different parameters on that. Okay. This is a group account. So we're going to create a new local group account. So the only member in that currently is Bob. So when you do that, you're going to name the group and description, marketing. In the marketing group, I don't think that's very descriptive, but it depends on how big the company is. You might have several different groups under marketing, and marketing might be one of the parent domains, and you've got several child underneath it, but you want some description on it so you know for sure that you're adding the person that you're going to be adding to that group to the right group. If you've got department numbers, you could add those here. to make it a little bit more descriptive and for sure that you're actually adding them to the correct group. Okay. So basically, Active Directory allows the single sign-on, so you can use any of the resources that are in Active Directory once you log on once. Okay. In Active Directory, users have accounts and also machines have accounts. So you've got two things. So when a person would walk into the company, you can't just bring your own laptop and plug it in and it works on the domain. You're going to actually have to create an account for that laptop or computer, whatever you're using. It could be iPad, anything, wireless connection. But you have to have an account for both of those. In Active Directory, has the database, and before an object can be created in that database, it must be set up as an available object. So basically, that's what you're going to have to do is go in and create this. The Active Directory schema stores a list of available objects, which are classes, and their properties or attributes. And the schema is basically just a list of those classes and attributes that you can actually set up and identify in Active Directory. You also have to be a member of the schema admins group within Active Directory to modify the schema. Okay. Okay. So once you log on, you put your ID into your computer token, and basically that token is the information in your user account. And then, of course, it's not just yours, it's any groups you have access to. Okay, there's three main container objects in Active Directory. There's the group, users, and computers, and all those are called leaf objects. Okay. Active Directory database basically can have unlimited number of users and objects, but it uses LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, to find the things in Active Directory. So you need to think about how many levels you're creating for that when you're doing that. Okay, and to basically organize everything, you've got container objects. The three main container objects are domains, OUs, organizational units. That basically organizes those leaf objects, and the sites. Basically, a site would be a physical location. If you've got a bunch of different locations in the organization, you would also have sites based on their physical location. Okay, in this figure, basically the triangle is the whole domain. And then you can use ovals or circles to represent the OUs. Basically, it tells you that you should use 5 levels or less for LDAP to be able to quickly find anything in here. Okay, each leaf object, anything that you actually give resources to, is given a quote distinguished name and then a common name. So the distinguished name is just unique, It includes the name and location of the object within the Active Directory database. And then the common name is just the name of the object that Active Directory has. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier. Each item in Active Directory is assigned a security identifier, a SID. So when you create that account, the database sets up this SID. And then it's given, of course, a very unique, globally unique identifier name. So it's easy to find it within Active Directory. So this is the reason it assigns those SIDs and that allows them access within the ACL. Okay, Active Directory forest trees and trusts. So basically, the first thing that you're going to create, if you're going to create a new domain, so you have to figure out the size of the company that you're doing. So you'll need to know the number of domains you're going to actually create. And the forest is the largest container within Active Directory. So you're going to create the forest. Then the very first domain in the forest is the forest root domain. Okay. And then the second one is the parent domain, an Active Directory domain that has like child domains underneath it. The child domain basically could be, let's see what they use in the example. Oh, they just changed the names of them. So you've got engineering, and then you've got a child domain under engineering. You've got civil, electrical, mechanical. Those could be the child domains. Okay. You can have a forest, and in the forest, you've got the DNS information saved, and you can have another forest or another tree in the same forest that they don't share the DNS information between the two domains. So those are the disjointed namespaces. To go back and forth are the contiguous namespaces. So if you're going to set this up, you're going to have a trust relationship between the domains. Okay. And there's a lot of different kinds of trust relationships, different levels. Okay. The transitive, it allows a trust relationship to apply to other trust relationships. And by default, the first parent domain in each tree trusts the first parent domain. And then each parent domain within a tree trusts their child domain with two-way transitive trust relationships. Okay, if you look at this figure here, you've got the two-way trust. It shows you that they trust each other, or each one has a one-way trust to the other one. So sort of gives you the just an easier way to look at it, I guess. Okay, if you've got a domain with the internal trust, and it's basically the trust relationship between domains within Active Directory Forest, and you've got printers and plotters located on these other ones, if they can print to anyone they want to, because we've got this internal trust, you could have an issue where users are printing to the wrong printer or plotter, depending on how you've named them. Or they've just got it set up by default. They use it the last time they open the application and it saves that information. They could be printing things to the wrong printers that way. So it can be good or bad depending on how you're setting things up. You can also set up a shortcut trust. It's just basically it's a trust between the two domains that are in the same Active Directory forest. Okay, note the two-way transitive features of trust relationships are derived from the Kuberos protocol. Oh, yes. And also on here, the forest trust, you can have a trust relationship that you set up between two Active Directory forest trusts. So basically, you can have an internal trust, you can have a shortcut trust. That's just between two domains within the same Active Directory forest. Or you can create a Active Directory domain outside of your forest and have an external trust with that for some reason, or to another Active Directory forest. That's a forest trust. Okay, Active Directory groups. There's two main types of group accounts. Distribution groups. It's used basically email system would, so Microsoft Exchange, Outlook would use the distribution groups. And security groups. The security group is what you're going to use to give permissions to the users or any group member, any object in Active Directory. You can set that up on. Okay, the group scopes. Basically, it's just to put everything to where it makes sense and set it in a group to organize it. And you can assign rights to those groups so you don't have to do it to each individual user, because you can imagine how time consuming that could be. Okay, the group scope determines where a group can be used and the objects that it can contain. Like the resources in a forest may be accessed by users in other domains across that trust relationship. So there's 3 group scopes. The global, it allows a group within any domain in the forest, but it restricts the membership to local domain objects. Okay, and then there's the domain local. It allows a group to be used within the domain that it belongs in, but it also allows members from any domain in the forest. And then there's a universal group scope, and this is used with any domain in the forest, and it can contain any forest objects. So universal basically is exactly what the word universal means. Okay, the global security groups, you can assign those permissions to resources, or you can add them to any group in any domain within the forest. They cannot contain objects from the same domain which they were created. Okay, and the local security groups can be assigned permissions or added as a member to any other group in the same domain. But they can contain objects from any domain in the forest. Okay, a note here, the process of adding a group to the membership of another group is called group nesting. Okay, so your universal security groups, they store their list of members within this global catalog. So you want to keep it small for fast performance. So you want it to respond pretty quickly. Then you need to keep these levels low. But basically, that's why you have the 3 different levels and security groups, to make it easy to modify access. You could create these global groups by departments in your company, as an example. Okay, domain and forest functional levels. The single sign-on was first brought out with the NT4 server, but no Active Directory. It uses the PDC, the primary domain controller, in the SAM database to authenticate users, which is the read-write access, and the backup domain controller, which has a copy of that same database on it. So if you made a change and you've got several domain controllers, then you make a change to the primary domain controller, that information has to be replicated to the backup domain controller. Okay, so, but the backup domain controller is a read-only copy. So how are you going to do that? You have to manually log into the domain controller and change it. Okay, with Windows Server 2000, it made everything backward compatible when Active Directory was actually introduced. So the new version, each version, of course, that it came out with had newer features, but it did make it backward compatible. Not everything works, but majority of them do. Has anybody used Active Directory at all for anything?
I have not.
Okay.
I think I touched on it in a class last semester, but no, I haven't.
Okay. I didn't know if you guys had the Active Directory in them. Okay, this basically is, this table is basically the different versions. Sorry, it's a touch screen. It's the different versions that Windows, and basically what they came out with, the features, the new features that they came out with. So there again, it's like, if you need that information, it's something you can look up, but this book seems to think it's so important. Okay, so you've got functional levels in here, and basically a domain functional level, it just dictates the minimum allowed domain controller version within a domain. That's basically what this is telling you. Okay. The domain functional level only applies to the domain controllers that host the Active Directory database for the domain. And each domain in the forest can operate at a different functional level. So they all don't have to be the same. So you don't have to buy new hardware or the software and update that. They will work together to a certain level. Okay, so if you're going to raise the forest functional level, then you have to make sure that each domain is raised to that functional level first. And then once you've gone and raised this to a functional certain level, you can't go backwards once it's been raised. So with Server 2008, they actually added the Active Directory recycle bin. So if you delete something, there you go. It saved that SID. But like I said, you have to be using that version and turn it on. So that did help with that, with the issue of deleting user IDs and losing the SID. But the issue is, if you're going to do that, what's it going to do? It's going to tie up those resources in the recycle bin with holding that information. Okay. Sites and directory replication. So objects that are replicated between the domain controllers, basically when a new object is added in Active Directory, If you move it, change it, delete it, not all that information is replicated to all the domain controllers within the forest. So the amount of information that it sends to all those other domain controllers is basically, it depends on how you got it set up, is how it's going to do that. Okay. The directory partitions, basically just a part of the Active Directory database. So replication takes place between the domain controller in the domain and the forest. So there's 3 sections of Active Directory. There's the schema, and that has to be identical on all domain controllers in the forest. So if you make a change on the domain controller, those changes are replicated to the domain controllers within the forest. Okay, then there's the configuration. Basically, it stores the structure and the layout of the forest, including the name of each object and the trust between them. So each domain controller must share the same configuration partition. So then it's replicated. Okay, then you've got the domain. And the domain, of course, is the largest section of the database because it stores all the objects, the users, the OUs, the groups, the PCs in the domain. And it only replicates to other domain controllers within the same domain. So basically, this level is where you're probably going to make changes, the most changes. So it controls the replication within an organization using the objects in Active Directory. Okay, the site object, it just represents a physical location in the LAN, local area network. That's all it does. You can have 1 or more subnets within that domain controller for those site objects. You could have a huge site. You could have a huge campus that has lots of different subnets in there. So the subnet object is basically an object in Active Directory, and it represents the IP network. And the site objects are connected to other site objects using site link objects that contains the information to specify how it replicates and if replication is allowed to occur. Okay, you've got the Active Directory represent an connection between the 2 sites. So the site objects are connected to other site objects using site link objects that contain the attributes that you specify, and replication is allowed to occur. So here is the Toronto-Chicago site link. You've set it up to where you don't want the traffic on the regular network, so you set up a site link from Toronto and Chicago. Okay, so the bridgehead server, basically it's the server that replicates only between the 2 sites in the single domain controller. So they all don't talk back and forth, only the bridgehead servers do. So Active Directory automatically chooses in this diagram, it would automatically choose which one of these is the bridgehead server, but you can manually override that. You can assign it yourself. You can also set the site link objects. You can actually control the replication of changes to the schema and the configuration partitions within the forest with this. You can also have down here with the large forest that you have multiple site link objects to allow multiple paths for replication. depending on how big your forest is that you've created. Okay, then you have this global catalog. Basically, it's just a list of all the objects in Active Directory forest. The forest has a unlimited number of domains, and each domain has an unlimited number of objects. But to quickly access within the different domains, a list of the objects names is in the forest. The global catalog is stored on the domain controller in the forest. Okay, and each one has a user principal name, and basically it's just your username at tctc.edu. So it's your username at the domain name, and that information is stored in the global catalog. Okay, so the global catalog is contacted to verify that user principal name and the location of a domain controller that can complete the authentication process. So when you try to log on, if you're not on the network, what happens if you've logged on to that machine before? It uses cached information. Okay, but the universal group membership is stored solely within this global catalog. So you get authentication tokens, and in that authentication token, it lists your group membership, the domain controllers that you have to contact to get the global catalog during the authentication process, and that determines your universal group membership. So if you've never logged on before, and if a global catalog can't be contacted, you're not going to be able to authenticate. So if the nearest global catalog is located in a remote site across the internet, it could take a while for a domain controller to respond with that authentication. So cache credentials is what we were talking about using if we can't access it. So usually the domain controller that's going to respond to you is physically the closest, but not necessarily. If that domain controller is busy doing something else, you may have another domain controller that actually authenticates a user. Okay, so that this note here in that situation, you want to make sure that each Active Directory has a copy of the global catalog for those reasons. You don't want your users sitting and waiting. Okay, you've also got universal group membership caching. In Active Directory, this is a site property that allows the domain controller to cache the universal group membership information for authenticated users. Flexible Single Master Operations, FSMO. These are the roles, basically, a domain controller function, and it's shared by all the domain controllers within a domain or forest. So in this table here, it shows you, like the schema master, the minimum requirements for these and the function of each one of these. So the PDC emulator, it's a FSMO role, and basically it coordinates the password changes, provides the synchronization within an Active Directory domain. Let's see. You still can't see this very well. Okay. The relative identifiers. Okay. basically this is that unique portion of that SID for Active Directory objects. You've got the RID master. Basically, that's going to generate a unique range of RIDs for each individual domain. And the SIDs are guaranteed to be unique among the domain objects. So there's 5 roles here. And the very first domain controller that you have in the forest root, it contains all 5 of these roles that are in here. So there's also called role seizure. It's basically where FSMO is forcibly transferred to another domain controller. So if you have a failure on one, you could have authentication issues. You also can't create new objects. So you might have to use the role seizure to transfer that. Because if you've got one per forest and one per domain number that you can have, you may have to move that to another domain controller, depending on if you have a hardware failure. I don't think I... Okay. Azure Active Directory is basically a service within the Microsoft Cloud that allows single sign-on for cloud services. Azure Active Directory can be configured to trust an organization's Active Directory forest or to mirror it using a synchronization service. Basically what that is. Okay, installing Active Directory. So of course there's a wizard to use. So once you've created the domain controller, you're going to install this on the system along with the management tools. And there's a lot of different management tools that you can use. Of course, you can use PowerShell to do any of this. You can use the Windows admin console. But if you'll look on here, you can choose any of these services to add to your server that you've created. So you already have a server out here. So you're going to add the Active Directory services to it. So it can be a domain controller in a new forest. So that's going to create the forest root domain. Or you could do a new domain controller for a new domain within an existing forest. Or you can do an additional domain controller within an existing domain. So you're seeing features that, say your monitoring software says that one of your domain controllers is having an issue. You can use this and add a new domain controller to an existing domain and then remove the other one. So it gives you all the options with that. And of course, you can use it using Windows Admin Console or PowerShell. I think this note is at the bottom of every one of these. Okay, so if we're going to install the forest root domain, then you're going to have to choose here what you're actually doing, which one of these options you're doing. Okay, so this example is the first domain controller for the first domain in a new forest. So you're going to specify the domain and the forest function levels. So those function levels we just looked at, you're going to set those up in here. what you want this to do. And the default domain and forest functional levels are set to the highest level by default. So if you don't want them to have the highest level, then you need to change them. Domain controller on a Windows Server 2008 and later. Okay, dynamic updates. So you have an existing DNS server, and so you've got all these service records to store the location in Active Directory. So you use this dynamic update, and it just allows the computers to automatically create records on the DNS server. So because each forest must have at least one global catalog, you can't deselect global catalog in here. And there was another one on here. You can't, this is grayed out also, the read-only domain controller. Okay, this is the first one we're creating, so it can't be read-only. If it allowed us to do this, what would happen? Basically, you've got a read-only copy of your Active Directory database, so you can't create any new objects. So also, if it's anything that carries the read-only domain controller, it also doesn't have as much information about the password attributes. Okay. So now you're going to configure the server as domain controller. So the Active Directory that was out there is actually going to replace that SAM database, but it's also going to replace any local accounts. So you're going to have to create a local admin account. Okay, if you have an issue with your Active Directory domain controller, it actually has here the directory services restore mode, and it should repair your database. So that DSRM account. So this also tells you that you can hold down the F8 key. Used to be PF8 during the boot process to go through the repair menu with that. Okay, this is what we're going to actually register the DNS server. The domain registrar is like the organization that registers domains on the internet. So you're actually going to create a new one. You're going to have to pay for that if you create a new domain. Okay, the NetBIOS name. How many characters can a NetBIOS name have?
Was it 15?
It is. And it can't have periods like the new naming convention allows you to. So if you're going to join a legacy computer to an Active Directory domain, you're going to have to make sure that you change that NetBIOS name of it. Anything older than Windows 2000, they use NetBIOS packets to locate the domain controller instead of the service records in DNS. So each domain controller has to have the NetBIOS name to allow those to join the domain, those older computers to join and find the domain controller for location.
Would it be
okay?
good practice to recommend names the same, like have the net BIOS name be the same as the,
Well, that and the fact that anything that you're going to do, you should have a naming convention, whatever nomenclature you're going to use for your company. All your servers should be named. Like if you've got servers at different sites, then part of that naming convention should be the site that the server is physically located on, or if it's a virtual server, have something in there to let you know it's a virtual server.
so you have all the info just by looking at the name to know where
Right.
something is
So,
and what
I mean,
it is.
it's common sense, you know, I can look at this name and it's not this Windows system NT whatever, and I have no idea where it's physically located. So, you know, that's part of setting it up, the planning process, the naming convention that you're going to use, and make sure that everybody understands that. So say you've got, you know, 2 or 3 people that are creating servers and you're all creating them with a different naming convention, then that's really going to make matters crazy later when you're trying to rename everything. Okay, in here, this figure here, Active Directory database file, make sure you know what it's called. So basically, when you make changes, it's written to a transaction log first before it's applied to the database, basically to increase performance. So you can change the location, the default folder path. You can also save a file and to a text file for any of these changes that you make. So you've got a timestamp on it, basically. Okay, and in here, of course, it saves it to the C drive. So you can change any of these, the sysvol, the log files, the database folders. You can change any of that information here on the path folder that when you're specifying that. Okay, basically you're going to review the changes that you made. And it's got all the information. It's got your net BIOS name that you're using, the forest functional level, domain functional level, all that's on here. So you can review all that before you finish this. Okay. And notice here, Active Directory is going to be installed and the server is going to reboot, and you're going to have to log in with an admin password and ID. So before it joins the domain. Okay. But also you notice you've got these warnings on here, but it does tell you at the bottom one, it will reboot. So once it reboots and you can join the domain, it joins the domain, then you can log on with the domain name, or on this one, it's actually logging in with as the administrator. Okay, so we have another option to install a domain with an existing forest. Just make sure that your IP configuration has the DNS service records for the existing Active Directory forest. So basically, this is the wizard to do that. And you're selecting the domain type, the parent, and the new domain name. So okay, if you're doing a parent domain for a new tree, you have to select the tree domain from the select domain drop down list. So when you choose select, you have to choose it from there. Okay. Oh yeah. On this one, if you're doing this, you have to be a member of the enterprise admin group. Okay, so you've got a domain admin group and enterprise. You have to be a member of the enterprise admin group to actually be able to install a domain in a forest. That's just to ensure that people know what they're doing and where they're actually creating items. Okay, same here. Make sure your IP configuration. So basically, you should have an IP tool that you're going to actually check out an IP address, gives you the thing. But IP address, subnet mask gateway, but it should also give you the domain name service information, and it should give you more than one. So you have it set up, you actually enter the IP address on this, you actually enter that information in there. So it makes this process much easier. So you're going to select add a domain controller to an existing domain. You're going to click change. You're going to use your admin ID. So two things are different from the new forest root domain. You can change the default Active Directory site where your new domain controller is going to be located, and also you can choose the domain controller where you want your new domain controller to get the initial copy of the Active Directory database. And of course, you can configure a new domain controller with PowerShell. I just think the GUI is so much better because it gives you more information when you're actually doing this. Okay, configuring Active Directory. We talked about the raising the functional levels in a domain. After a domain controller has been raised to a common minimum operating system version, then you can raise the domain functional level, and that we talked about earlier with the recycle bin. Domain admin to raise a domain functional level. And if you're going to raise the first level, you have to log in as the enterprise domain admin. Okay, to raise functional levels, basically you click in Active Directory Domains and Trusts, and under Tools, menu and Server Manager. So here we go. We're going to raise the domain functional level. So you're going to choose here. So you've already updated all of your servers to server 2012 R2. What's R2?
Is that generation?
Yeah, it's a revision that they made. It originally came out with 2012. It added some more functionality to this 2012. Basically, this Active Directory is just a graphical tool that lets you configure that functional levels and trust relationships. So you've got actions, and you can right click and go to more actions down here. Once you click on it, it shows up. So you're going to raise the domain functional level. You're going to choose it. Of course, it's going to give you the warning. You can't go back. Okay. And who wants to get how you can also do that? Okay, creating trust relationships. If you join two organizations, you can create an external relationship, a forest, or a realm trust. So that organization can allow resources to be accessed between the two organizations. So basically, if you bought somebody else and you wanted to do that, you can set these trust relationships up. Or you can create an internal trust from a parent domain in one tree to a child domain in another tree. And that'll actually speed up the resource access between those two domains. And of course, you have to be a member of the enterprise admins group to do that. But first, you need to ensure that the DNS servers servers within your organization can resolve the DNS records for the target organization and vice versa. You can use conditional forwarding. It's a DNS server feature. Basically, it allows requests for a particular domain to a particular target DNS server. Okay, so 426, it's the trust tab on the domain property. And this is what it looks like. You're going to select your domain in Add Trust Tool. You're going to click More Actions. You see on the Trust tab, it starts that new trust wizard. Then you're going to choose the target domain for the new trust.
Irritating.
If the DNS server can resolve the records for the new domain, you can then do any of these options down here. Select the trust type. Choose the direction of the trust. So you need to understand how these trusts work, and if you're going to give access to this new company, if they need access to your records, yes or no would be a two-way trust. If they don't need access to your records, but you need access to their records, you'd set up a one-way trust. Okay, so here's the trust relationship. You can delete a trust, just click it and remove it. So if you set something up and it didn't work, you can just remove it and create a new one. And also, you can use the net.dom exe command within PowerShell. Okay, this is managing those roles we talked about earlier. So you're going to need to know which domain controller holds the forest-wide and domain-wide roles. You can use, there's a query that you can actually use this command from PowerShell. And when you run that, it's going to give you the list. And so make sure that you don't have only one domain controller that holds all the roles. Make sure that you've got multiple roles.
She going to get the fuck out of my way.
Somebody's mic is turned on. Clinton. Okay. And of course, you have to be a member of the Enterprise Admins group. Okay, configuring site and replication. So you want to be able to control how your Active Directory replication occurs between your domain controllers. You can use your sites to control the replication schema and forest configuration to other domains within your forest. This Active Directory sites and services basically is just a tool that configures the sites and global catalog services. So the only sites created within a new forest is called default first site name and contains the first domain controller within the forest. So if you look at this diagram, 429, that's what it named it. So you're going to want to rename that to where it makes sense to you. Okay, here's how you're going to create a new site object. So you've got the Chicago site. Okay, I don't know why you're going to put site on there. You know it's a site by the name, Chicago. But basically, you'd go through this and you create, for each site that you have, you'd create a site location. So if you needed to move a domain controller from one site to another, basically you can right click it and click move, and then you just select the target. Then you're going to actually go and set the IPs IP addresses that are associated with that. So that IP subnet, you set that for your new sites. Okay, you can also apply the group policies to that. So if you've got a whole group of people, you want all those people in that group, that site, whatever, you could set a group policy up for that site that you've just created, that they have access to everything in the engineering department or everything in the marketing or business group. Okay, and there's not a limit to the number of subnet objects that you can associate with a single site. So if you've got a really big campus, then it may take you a while to set up all the IP subnets for that. Okay, there's two protocols that can be used. Oh, I thought this was sort of weird. The timing that they chose to replicate is only during business hours from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So, and it's not available for this big window. So replication can happen anytime. So basically it's unavailable after hours. So what happens if something breaks and somebody needs access to something and you don't have it replicated? Then they're not gonna be able to access what they need. I just thought it was odd that they turned replication off. And I understand it takes up resources, but I think you really need to think about your time frame that you set up this replication schedule for. Okay. You can configure the bridgehead server. Remember before I told you by default that Active Directory chooses it. This is where you can actually decide which your bridgehead server is. Okay. I want to talk about the protocols that are used for the replication. Basically, it uses IP, but it also uses SMTP for replication, when it replicates between the domain controllers. So basically, it uses those two protocols. So if you make changes in Active Directory to a user account, when do they take effect?
Is it the next time the user logs in?
That's correct. They have to log off and log back on for it to take effect. So if you give somebody access to something and they're like, you tell them, hey, I've given you access to this, and it's had time to replicate to all the domain controllers in there, then you have them log off and log back on, because they aren't going to have access at all until they do that. Okay. This shows you how to configure your global catalog and UGMC. Okay. Basically, you're going to ensure that each site has at least one, and usually two for fault tolerance, copies of the global catalog. So it provides fast logon, fast object search. Of course, too many of them are going to affect the network performance as the global catalog is replicated forest-wide. So if you don't adhere to like the site link restrictions, which you can actually configure that also. So you're going to configure your global catalog. So we want a description on it. You might have a reason that you can't host a global catalog on the site. Say it's a super small site and they have to be able to access it. You can enable the universal group membership caching for that. So if you've got a really small site, you're not going to put a domain controller on that site. It's going to take them a long time every time they need to log on and authenticate, unless it uses the caching. So you can set that caching on the domain controller to do that. And of course, you can use Windows PowerShell to do that. Okay, managing Active Directory objects, whether you're creating them or changing them. This is the most used in Active Directory, and you'll probably use this on a daily basis if you have Active Directory and you have that. That's going to be one of your job titles, because people all the time need access to something else. You have people come, you have people go. So if they leave, then you're going to have to be the one that actually disables that ID. So you're going to have to know how to use this. And basically, just be familiar with the way it's set up and how to find things. Okay, so you've created a new domain. So by default, it only has one OU. But it's got these, the built-in, these names over here, built-in groups, the computer group, foreign security principles group, managed service accounts, and user containers. So by default, those are already set up. So basically your users is what you're going to probably use them the most. So basically, if you're going to create a new OU, it's the same as creating it in Windows. And you can use PowerShell. Wow. Okay, so what we talked about before, make sure you know the nomenclature that you're going to use. Make them change their password. Okay, so all these things listed right here, the information and the tabs on a user once you've created them. Okay, so if you've given Bob access to a group, then you can go to all the member of, and those are all the groups that you've given Bob access to. He can have remote desktop. So if he's got a different profile for at home, you can have the remote desktop services profile. You want to know what address he is. If you've got a huge site, where he works in an organization, you're going to want to know what department he works in. That should give you some information as to what he really needs access to. Whether he's got remote control, which he's not, because he works in the marketing department. He's not in IT. He doesn't need remote control access. So once you've created this new user, if you're going to create a whole bunch of them that work in the same department, they need the same access, you can create an actual template user account. You can do it however you want to do it, by department, by company, and then you can use that and then go in and create this information and copy it to this new user from the template. So they all have the exact same access. Of course, if they change departments, you can move them, you can disable them, and then of course you can actually delete them. You could set up a test user to see if they have access to certain things. So you could use it for that. But just before you do that, sit down and figure out what kind of information you're going to use. And of course, if you delete the user object, the SIDs change. So the SID also cannot be reused by another one. Okay, the same before. You want to know the the nomenclature you're going to use, the naming convention, syntax, whatever you want to call it. And you're going to create a group. You're going to supply the group type, the scope, the name, depending on what it's, what scope it needs, domain, global, universal, and whether it's a security group or a distribution group. So you can, because this is a group, you can see the members that this group has in it, and these are the users, and also the member of this group could be a member of another group. Okay, computer accounts may need to be moved to another location, but you can also pre-stage them. So this shows you how to pre-stage a computer account. So if you've got a computer that you're getting ready to put out, I don't understand this naming convention that they're using, marketing East 19. That doesn't tell me anything really about it. And that would be real easy to duplicate. Use the serial number of the machine as the computer name. Of course, you're going to have to use your domain admin ID to create this. You can use it doing PowerShell. If you've got a pre-Windows 2000 computer, in here, I'll show you something. Okay, see right here, assign the computer account as a pre-Windows computer. If you click that, it's not even going to try to contact that with the group policy. So basically, you can set these up to where if they're not on the within so many days, that ID is automatically deleted. So that way you'll know whether the users are actually using these machines they're asking for. So each computer has an encryption key when that computer talks to the domain. So the domain controller creates a new encryption key every 2 weeks, and it communicates that key to the client to update the Windows registry. So when you're doing this, your machine has an encryption key also. Okay, this is the Active Directory Admin Center tool. Basically, it's the same tool that you can use. Actually, I like Active Directory better for users and computers. Okay, here's our read-only domain controller. So if you've got a site that you don't want to tie up the bandwidth for, or you don't have a lot of security, this actually suggests you don't have somebody physically sitting there. You can use a read-only domain controller. So if it is stolen, like this scenario says, you can actually go in and you can force Active Directory to reset the passwords for all the user accounts or objects that had any kind of password attribute on this read-only domain controller by deleting the read-only domain computer account. So these are the warnings that if you're going to go in here and delete it, that are going to show up. Of course, you're going to have a admin ID on that domain. You're going to have to know the read-only domain controller computer name. Okay, to me, this chapter, this module, the most confusing thing are the trust relationships when you're trying to set those up. That's the most confusing. So when you do that, you need to plan for that. And just, to me, it makes more sense if I draw it out like the diagram they had. Okay, there's 2 labs with this module. both of those that have the orange dot on them that are graded. If you can work on those, we need those done by Thursday. And then we'll also review for this module test Thursday and take the test during class on Thursday. Any questions?
None for me.
All right. Thanks. You guys have a good day.
You too.
How do you